So, after we have now spoken about various European empires and their colonization of the New World, I want to move now to talking specifically about the British American colonies. The reason for this is in American history course, you follow this path. So we will talk less and less as the course goes on about the Spanish, French, and Dutch, and more about the British and eventually the United States government. And so here we move into specifically the British American colonies. So in 1607, Jamestown is settled by younger, lower class men who were employees of the Virginia Company. Now, their plan is get rich quick. Get in, get gold and silver like the Spanish did, and get out. However, they get to Jamestown, and they're prepared really just for the mining for the precious metals. And they were very unsuccessful at what their plan for food and shelter was, which was we'll figure that out when we get there. They were very unsuccessful at growing their own food, and this leads to what's referred to as the starving time. And in addition to the lack of food, they were super smart, sarcasm, in having settled next to a swamp in which everyone was getting malaria from mosquitoes coming out of that swamp. In the first decade of settlement at Jamestown, it was actually abandoned 2 different times and suffered an 80% death rate. And without the help of the local Powhatan tribe, which the tribe itself is named after their chief, Chief Powhatan, the settlement probably would have permanently failed. So with aid from the Powhatan, the Jamestown settlement is actually saved. Which leads me to the story of Pocahontas. We are very misinformed by what everyone typically thinks of when they hear the name Pocahontas, and that is the Disney movie. Yes, Disney wants to make nicey nice children's movies, but it is very historically inaccurate. In particular, the story of Pocahontas rescuing John Smith from a possible death sentence by her father and the other men of the tribe. The reality is she never was in love with John Smith at all. She certainly didn't save his life. There's some speculation, in fact, that her stopping her father from killing John Smith was all part of a ceremony in which John Smith was symbolically killed and then welcomed back into the tribe as a reborn person. There's a lot of speculation to that. There's, in fact, a really great PBS documentary about this. But Pocahontas never did love John Smith. She actually married a man by the name of John Rolfe. Now, you've probably never heard of John Rolfe. Meanwhile, he had a greater impact on the development of the British American colonies and therefore American history than John Smith did. But the story, as it goes into films like the Disney Pocahontas movie, it's nicer to have this love affair between Pocahontas and John Smith, even though it's not real. What is it about John Rolfe that makes him have such a much more impressive impact? He brings tobacco to Virginia, and tobacco becomes the lifeblood of what becomes a cash crop empire in the South. Another famous settlement that there's a lot of misinformation surrounding this, probably not near as much as the story of Pocahontas and Chief Powhatan and Jamestown, but nonetheless some inaccuracies, is the Pilgrims settle what is today Cape Cod in modern Massachusetts, just south of what is today the city of Boston. This is much like Christopher Columbus and he's lost. The Pilgrims get lost. They actually wanted to settle in Virginia, but they establish this settlement much too far north. They are completely ill prepared for the climate, and they go through a starving time as well. They are only saved by a local tribe, the Pocahontas, and a man, Tisquantum, who goes by Squanto in history. And Squanto taught, most importantly, how to hunt, fish, and plant for food. In particular, what is known as the Three Sisters, planting corn, bean, and squash together. And that they do very well when planted together. So the Plymouth settlement is saved by local tribes in much the same way that Jamestown was saved by local tribes. So what is it that leads to the British North American colonies to develop the way they did? If you play a sport or you watch sports on TV and you see a coach getting interviewed and say, "Coach, you had a great game today. So what'd you do?" And a lot of times you'll hear a coach say, "We took what the defense gave us." And that's a phrase that I like to use when pointing out exactly how each region of the British North American colonies developed. The settlers of these regions took what geography provided to them. So in sports, you take what the defense gives you. Well, in human history, people settle in areas where they can take advantage of the natural geography of the area. Even ancient river valley civilizations, this is true. So, in much of North America, you have extremely, extremely fertile soil. And what comes to be known as the Middle Colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, foodstuffs are grown in mass amounts. Foodstuffs just means a large amount of food that is far more than any individual family could need. You actually make a living selling what you have beyond what your family needs. In the Southern Colonies, also very fertile soil, but the difference being also a much warmer climate with a longer growing season, you have cash crops like tobacco. And then later in history, I'm barely going to talk about it now because I don't like the confusion, is cotton. Cotton will come later. But right now, in this early British colonial period, the only common widespread cash crop is tobacco. And it is the trading of all of these raw materials that became most profitable for the British and therefore the New England colonies in places like Massachusetts, Connecticut, or even the port of New York. Why were these places all of a sudden trading hubs? It was because of the natural harbors that existed there. There was deep water, deep enough for ships to pull right up almost to shore. And so once the economy continues to develop, you also have things like shipbuilding and manufacturing going on in New England. Lots of fishing and whaling as well. And part of the reason here is that New England had very, very rocky and less fertile soil than the Middle and Southern Colonies did. So the fertile soil in the Middle and Southern Colonies leads to things like foodstuffs and cash crops. The lack of good soil in New England leads to much more trading, shipbuilding, manufacturing, etc. So the natural geography made it obvious what was going to be the lifeblood of a certain region. So you can see colorations here. The southern border of Pennsylvania today, modern border, with Maryland is referred to as the Mason-Dixon line. And really south of this line is where you're going to see a lot of the cash crop farming going on. It is in these middle colonies that you're going to see the foodstuffs providing a living to everyone. And then in the New England coastal communities, you're going to notice the shipping, manufacturing being much more of the local economy. Now, how did this enrich the British Empire? Mercantilism was an economic system in which Britain and other European powers did this with their colonies as well. Britain was able to create a favorable balance of trade with their North American colonies. So raw materials, this is a term that would refer to things like gold, silver, fur, lumber, foodstuffs, etc. They're going to come out of the colonies and to the mother country. Then finished goods flow back out of the mother country and into the colony and the rest of the world for huge profit margins for the empire, for the mother country. And it is this mercantilist system that's mutually beneficial for the longest time for both the empire and the colonies, and eventually push is going to come to shove and lead to the American Revolution. Now, how did the British choose to interact with the indigenous population of North America, particularly the Iroquois, which we are most familiar with in New York? The British established the covenant chain with the Iroquois. And it was in this agreement that the British agreed to limit frontier settlement so that the Iroquois would not feel encroached upon. We will come back to this concept when, after the French and Indian War, better known as the 7 Years' War, they established this policy, the Proclamation of 1763. Nobody can settle further west than the Appalachian Mountains. The British have a goal of not encroaching upon the Iroquois, but lower class colonists that came to the New World for cheap access to land to try to make themselves a better life were angry with the British Crown because this meant that they couldn't have what they had come to the New World for. Now, the Iroquois agree to the covenant chain because they see it as a very similar agreement to one they had reached with the Dutch in 1613, and that agreement is very well depicted by the two-row wampum, which you can see pictured here below. And so the Iroquois had had a good experience with the Dutch. The Dutch were really only interested in trading for furs. As I showed you in a previous presentation, the seal of New Netherlands had a beaver on it because of the importance of the fur trade. And so the Dutch had a very respectful and agreeable relationship with the Iroquois, and the Iroquois assumed that the British would do the same. And the British attempted, I guess you could say, to abide by that, but the American colonists were not going to allow that to happen. So why in quotes here do I say American, the rise of American governance? Like I was telling you before, the system of mercantilism was mutually beneficial to both the empire, the British Empire, the Crown, and the American colonists. Everybody was making a healthy amount of money. Obviously, the empire was making far more profits, but if you were raising crops or if you were a shipbuilder or a manufacturer in the New World, you were making plenty of money as well. And this mutually beneficial situation was even more acceptable to the American colonists because the British kind of let them run their own show. They let them run their own society. They let them have their own governments for the most part. For example, the Colonial Assembly in Virginia was known as the House of Burgesses. This was a democratic body that made decisions for the colony. And by the British allowing this kind of flexibility and this kind of self-leadership for the colonies is referred to in history as salutary neglect. And this is something else that leads to the American Revolution, because after the French and Indian War, again better known as the 7 Years' War, the British government tries to institute more rules, such as the Proclamation of 1763, on the colonists, and the colonists were used to kind of operating on their own due to salutary neglect. So the British are creating a situation for themselves that is not exactly going to work out because the American Revolution comes to be. So the colonial press, the concept of free speech in this time period, was thought to only really belong to public officials who debated on the floor of an elected assembly, such as the Virginia House of Burgesses. There was really no protections for the common citizen. You could be thrown in jail or even beheaded for what could be referred to as blasphemous talk against the crown. So there is no real free press. You can also be thrown in jail for what's referred to, if you're a journalist, as seditious libel, which was very famously debated in the case of a journalist, John Peter Zenger, who was jailed for libel after criticizing the New York colonial governor, Sir William Cosby. So Zenger is actually acquitted. And this kind of sets the stage for later on the drafting of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, etc. Because Zenger's defense was, nothing I printed was false, so it can't be considered libel. You see depictions of Sir William Cosby on the left and John Peter Zenger on the right. And this is a very, very famous story because it kind of sets the stage for the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights later in history. Good example of how the American colonists were not all that interested in being part of a united nation, shall we say. And even this Albany Plan of Union suggestion wouldn't have been so much a nation as it was cooperation amongst the colonies on behalf of the British Empire. So in 1754, which is actually the very beginning of the French and Indian War in North America, which is one small part of the larger 7 Years' War that was going on globally between the British and the French. But what's going on specifically in North America is historically referred to as the French and Indian War. And so at the beginning, Ben Franklin actually is the one who came up with this plan, the Albany Plan of Union. And he said to all of the colonies, hey, we should all band together to fight against the French, because if we don't, we're going to be picked apart piece by piece. And no agreement was ever reached because the individual colonies actually preferred to keep their autonomy rather than cooperate for safety. And again, much like I would compare the John Peter Zenger trial, the Zenger case, to the First Amendment, I would compare this lack of desire to cooperate as a united group to the concept of the Ninth and Tenth Amendment, which deal with states' rights and limiting the power of the federal government. And we will come back to these concepts when we get to covering that material later in the course. So you have the French and Indian War that spans from 1754, as I pointed out before, and it lasts until 1763. So for about 9 years, the British and French are duking it out essentially over who's going to get to control North America. The main focal point is gaining control of the Ohio River Valley. Both the British and French had settled there, had laid claim to it, but a lot of the fighting is actually done here in New York State. Famous battles are fought in what is today the Adirondacks, and the most famous of which is that of the Battle of Fort William Henry, which is on the southern shore of Lake George. This battle is very well depicted in the book The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper, which has been redone into movies numerous times, most recently in 1992. It is not so much the war itself that leads to the American Revolution. As a matter of fact, British subjects, colonists, loyally fought on behalf of their empire, the British, against the French. And the British were victorious, beat the French, and gained control, as you can see in these maps here, of the territories up to the Mississippi River. And then you see in green what is Spanish territory at the time eventually becomes French territory. You can see here the tan coloration indicating what is English territory, and you see this line going through the middle of it. And that is the proclamation line that the British established to say you cannot settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. And this was to avoid conflict with the tribal units living further west than this line. And you can see a zoomed in version here of the Hudson River Valley, which had a lot of the fighting going on during the French and Indian War. It was the upper Hudson Valley and the Lake George area where you see the Battle of Fort William Henry taking place. But it was this proclamation line that really led to particularly the lower class colonists who wanted access to land being really angry with the British Crown. They were often, they being these lower class folks, the ones who fought in the battles on behalf of the empire and then felt as though they had done so for no benefit of their own when, after the war, this proclamation line is declared by the empire. So this is kind of step number one to why the American Revolution happens. And we will return to this concept when we discuss the revolution itself. If you have any questions, by all means, reach out to me or ask in class, and I will see you in class.